I never imagined I'd be standing at the back of St. Catherine's Chapel, watching my 67-year-old husband, Clayton Shaw, exchange vows with his college sweetheart, when I pulled out 3 bank statements that would shatter everything. But there I was after 42 years of marriage, holding the proof of his ultimate betrayal, while he promised to love and cherish Savannah Gray forever. The congregation sat in stunned silence as Clayton slipped the ring onto her finger, completely unaware that I'd discovered where our retirement savings had really gone, why our mortgage had mysteriously been refinanced, and how he'd been funding their dream wedding for months. Sometimes the most devastating truths come printed on quarterly statements, and I was about to prove that 3 pieces of paper could unravel 42 years of lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. There's a special kind of silence that falls over a church when someone interrupts a wedding ceremony. It's not the peaceful hush of reverence or the expectant quiet before vows are exchanged. It's the sharp, breathless silence of shock, the collective intake of breath when something unthinkable happens in what should be the most sacred of moments. I was standing in the back of St. Catherine's Chapel on that crisp October afternoon, watching my husband of 42 years, Clayton Shaw, marry another woman. At 67, he looked distinguished in his charcoal gray suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture straight despite the arthritis he complained about constantly at home. Beside him stood Savannah Gray, radiant at 64, her auburn hair swept into an elegant updo, her cream-colored dress flattering her still slender figure. They looked like the perfect mature couple, 2 people who had found love again later in life, ready to spend their golden years together in blissful companionship. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was technically still married to the groom. Clayton had filed for divorce 6 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences and claiming our marriage had been dead for years. He'd moved out of our colonial home in Pinehurst Heights, supposedly to give us both space to figure things out. What he'd actually been doing was planning his future with Savannah, the woman who'd re-entered his life 2 years ago when she moved, back to Millbrook after her own husband's death. I should have been somewhere else that afternoon. Maybe at my sister's house, wallowing in self-pity with a bottle of wine and a romantic comedy. Maybe at my pottery class, losing myself in the therapeutic rhythm of shaping clay. Maybe anywhere but sitting in the back pew of the church where Clayton and I had been married 4 decades earlier, watching him promise forever to someone else. But I had 3 bank statements in my purse that changed everything. The first statement was from our joint savings account, the one Clayton claimed had been depleted by my excessive spending on household expenses and what he dismissively called my little hobbies. According to him, our nest egg had dwindled to almost nothing, which was why we couldn't afford the European cruise I'd dreamed of for our 40th anniversary, why we'd had to cancel our subscription to the Symphony, why I'd been asked to pick up generic brands at the grocery store and skip my monthly hair appointments. The second statement was from Clayton's personal checking account, one I'd discovered by accident when a piece of mail was delivered to our old address and forwarded to the apartment I'd been renting since our separation. This account, which shouldn't have existed according to our financial arrangements, showed deposits that far exceeded Clayton's pension and Social Security combined. Regular transfers from sources I didn't recognize, mysterious payments that didn't align with anything I knew about our finances. The third statement was the most damaging of all. It was from a credit line secured against our family home, the house my grandmother had left to me, the property that was supposed to be my security in case anything happened to Clayton. He'd somehow managed to take out a substantial loan against my inheritance without my knowledge, and the funds had been systematically withdrawn over the past 18 months. I knew exactly where that money had gone. It had paid for the down payment on the lakeside cottage where Clayton and Savannah were planning to live. It had funded their weekend getaways to the wine country. It had purchased the engagement ring that was now sparkling on Savannah's finger as she gazed adoringly into my husband's eyes. Most painfully of all, it had paid for this very wedding. The flowers, the catering, the photographer who was currently capturing their joy for posterity. My husband had stolen from me to finance his new life with another woman. The discovery had come just 3 days earlier, and I'd spent every waking moment since then deciding what to do with this information. My lawyer had assured me that the fraudulent transactions would strengthen my position in the divorce proceedings. My sister, Quinn, had urged me to take the evidence straight to the police. My friend from pottery class, Kennedy Hayes, had suggested I simply disappear with whatever assets I could access and start fresh somewhere else. But as I sat in that chapel, watching Clayton promise to honor and cherish Savannah with the same words he'd once spoken to me, a different plan crystallized in my mind. These people deserved to know exactly what kind of man they were celebrating. The wedding guests, many of whom had known Clayton and me as a couple for decades, deserved to understand why our marriage had really ended. And Savannah, despite being the other woman, deserved to know what her new husband was capable of when it came to financial deception. The minister, Reverend Patterson, was approaching the crucial moment in the ceremony. If anyone has a reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. It was a ritualistic phrase, rarely expecting an actual response. In most weddings, it passed by as a formality, a nod to tradition before the final vows were exchanged. But as those words echoed through the chapel, I felt a surge of clarity that I hadn't experienced in months. I stood up slowly, the rustle of my navy dress cutting through the expectant silence. Every head in the church turned toward me, expressions ranging from curiosity to horror as recognition dawned on their faces. Clayton's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Savannah looked confused, glancing between me and her soon-to-be husband with growing alarm. "I do," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel's excellent acoustics. "I have 3 very good reasons why this marriage should not proceed." I reached into my purse and withdrew the bank statements, holding them up so the congregation could see them, even if they couldn't read the devastating details from their seats. Before Clayton Shaw makes any more promises about love, honor, and commitment, I think everyone here should know exactly how he's been financing this fairy tale romance. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that sacred space as 47 wedding guests processed what was happening. The photographer's camera clicked reflexively, capturing the moment when a scorned wife decided that truth was more important than propriety. And in that moment, as I prepared to reveal the depths of Clayton's betrayal to everyone he cared about, I realized I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. To understand how I became the woman who destroyed her husband's wedding with 3 pieces of paper, you need to know who I used to be. My name is Eliza Shaw, though for most of my adult life, I've simply been known as Clayton's wife. At 64, I had spent the majority of my existence living in the shadow of a man I believed I knew completely, playing the role of the supportive spouse so thoroughly that I'd almost forgotten there had ever been a person named Eliza King before I became Mrs. Shaw. Our story began in 1981 at Millbrook Community College, where I was studying elementary education, and Clayton was working toward his business degree. I was 22, fresh-faced and optimistic, with dreams of teaching kindergarten and maybe opening my own daycare center someday. Clayton was 25, confident and ambitious, already talking about the accounting firm he planned to establish and the comfortable life he would build for his future family. He pursued me with the same methodical determination he applied to everything else in his life. Flowers every Friday, dinner dates at nice restaurants I couldn't afford on my part-time job income, and long conversations about our future together. Clayton had a way of making plans that sounded like romantic promises. He painted a picture of our life together with such vivid detail that I could practically see the white picket fence and feel the security of being chosen by someone so certain about what he wanted. "You won't need to work once we're married, Eliza," he'd tell me as we walked across campus hand in hand. "I'll make enough to take care of both of us. You can focus on making our home beautiful and maybe volunteer with children's programs if you want to stay connected to education." It sounded wonderful at the time. Being taken care of, being valued enough that someone wanted to shoulder all the financial responsibility so I could focus on creating a warm, welcoming home. I was young enough to mistake control for care, organization, for love. When Clayton suggested I switch my major to art therapy since I wouldn't really need a teaching degree anyway, I agreed without question. When he recommended I move in with him during our senior year to start practicing being a team, I saw it as romantic rather than practical. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We married 3 months after graduation in the same chapel where I would later disrupt his second wedding. I wore my grandmother's dress, carried roses from Clayton's mother's garden, and promised to love, honor, and obey until death do us part. Clayton's vows were perfectly crafted, delivered with the confidence of a man who had planned every word. He promised to provide for me, protect me, and give me a life better than anything I could create for myself. And for the first few years, it seemed like he was keeping those promises. Clayton's accounting practice grew steadily. We bought our first house in Pinehurst Heights, a modest 3-bedroom ranch that Clayton immediately began planning to expand. I threw myself into the role of homemaker with the enthusiasm of someone who believed she was living her dream. I learned to cook Clayton's favorite meals, decorated our home with careful attention to his preferences, and managed our social calendar with the efficiency of a professional event planner. When Clayton suggested I shouldn't pursue substitute teaching because it would interfere with my availability for business dinners and networking events, I agreed. When he recommended against joining the local art association because the membership fees were an unnecessary expense, I found free ways to pursue my creative interests. When he gently discouraged friendships with women he deemed too demanding or negative influences, I gradually let those relationships fade. I told myself this was what successful marriages looked like: compromise, teamwork, putting the partnership ahead of individual desires. Clayton was building something important, and my job was to support that vision. He handled all our finances because he was the expert. He made decisions about major purchases because he understood our long-term goals. He chose our vacation destinations because he'd researched them thoroughly and knew what would give us the best value. Slowly, methodically, I disappeared into the role of Mrs. Clayton Shaw. The process was so gradual that I didn't notice it happening. One day, I was Eliza King, a young woman with opinions and dreams and a voice of her own. The next day, or so it seemed in retrospect, I was Clayton's wife, a supporting character in his carefully orchestrated life. I managed our household with increasing efficiency, entertained his business associates with practiced charm, and maintained the social connections that benefited his career. Our home became a showplace, featured twice in the local home and garden magazine. I developed a reputation as an exceptional hostess, someone who could throw together an elegant dinner party on short notice, or organize a fundraising event that exceeded all expectations. Clayton's colleagues' wives often asked for my advice on everything from flower arrangements to wine selection to navigating the complex social dynamics of professional networking. I was successful at being Clayton's wife. The problem was, I had completely lost track of who Eliza was underneath all that success. When we couldn't have children after 5 years of trying, Clayton handled it with his typical pragmatic approach. "It's probably for the best," he said, holding me as I cried over yet another negative pregnancy test. "We can focus on building our life together, travel more, really invest in each other." He arranged for us to see specialists, managed the insurance paperwork, and eventually suggested we stop trying and embrace the freedom of being a couple. I threw myself even deeper into the role of perfect wife. If I couldn't be a mother, I would be the most devoted spouse imaginable. I took cooking classes to expand my repertoire. I learned about wines and antiques and gardening. I became fluent in the art of conversation with people I had nothing in common with, except our husbands' professional connections. By our 20th anniversary, people frequently commented on what a perfect couple we were. Clayton was successful and respected, always impeccably dressed and well-informed about current events. I was elegant and accommodating, known for my ability to make anyone feel welcome in our home. We attended the right events, supported the right charities, took tasteful vacations to destinations that provided good conversation starters at dinner parties. What they didn't see was the gradual erosion of my independence, the way I'd stopped expressing opinions that might conflict with Clayton's, the way I'd learned to anticipate his needs and preferences so thoroughly that I rarely had to think about my own. I'd become a beautifully maintained accessory to his life, polished and presentable and completely hollow. For 42 years, I told myself this was what I'd wanted: security, stability, a life free from financial worry or major conflict. Clayton took care of everything that mattered, and I took care of everything that made life pleasant and comfortable. It wasn't until I was sitting in that chapel, holding evidence of his ultimate betrayal, that I realized I'd been taking care of a man who had never truly seen me as anything more than a useful and decorative extension of himself. And now he was promising to love and cherish another woman with the same practiced sincerity he'd once shown me. The first crack in my carefully constructed world appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, hidden inside what should have been routine paperwork. I was sitting at the antique writing desk in our sunroom, the one Clayton had surprised me with for our 35th anniversary, sorting through the mail with the methodical precision that had become second nature after decades of managing our household. The envelope was addressed to both of us. Thick cream paper with the logo of Henderson & Associates Financial Planning embossed in navy blue. I assumed it was our quarterly investment summary, the kind of document Clayton usually reviewed privately before filing away in his home office. But he'd left early that morning for a 3-day conference in the state capitol, and something made me decide to open it rather than add it to the pile of mail waiting for his return. What I found inside changed everything. The letter was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Clayton Shaw, but the content made it clear that someone at Henderson & Associates believed I was an active participant in financial decisions I'd never heard of. They were writing to confirm the restructuring of your retirement portfolio and to schedule a meeting to discuss the additional life insurance policies you've requested for estate planning purposes. I read the letter 3 times, each pass, leaving me more confused than the last. Restructuring our retirement portfolio? Additional life insurance? These were significant financial decisions, the kind that would affect our future security. Yet I had no memory of any discussions about such changes. Clayton handled our investments, had always handled them, but surely something this major would have required my input, my signature, my presence at meetings. With growing unease, I walked to Clayton's home office, a converted bedroom that had always been his private domain. The door was typically locked, but I knew where he kept the spare key, taped under the bottom drawer of the antique desk in the hallway, a hiding place he'd shown me years ago, in case of emergency. This felt like an emergency. The office was immaculately organized as I'd expected. Clayton's business background had trained him to maintain detailed records, and his filing system was a thing of beauty. Everything labeled, everything in its proper place, everything documented with the precision of a man who understood that paperwork was the foundation of financial security. I found our investment folder in the second drawer of his filing cabinet, thick with statements and correspondence dating back several years. As I spread the documents across his desk, a picture began to emerge that left me feeling physically ill. Our retirement accounts had indeed been restructured, but not in the way I would have expected or approved of. The conservative mix of bonds and mutual funds that Clayton had always described as our safety net for the future had been systematically liquidated over the past 18 months. The proceeds had been reinvested in what appeared to be much riskier ventures: startup companies, speculative real estate investments, and something called alternative income streams that I couldn't begin to understand. More disturbing was the discovery that several of these new investments were made in Clayton's name only, despite being funded with money from our joint accounts. I found paperwork for limited liability companies I'd never heard of, business partnerships that had apparently been formed without my knowledge, and investment agreements that should have required both of our signatures but showed only Clayton's careful script. The life insurance policies mentioned in the Henderson and Associates letter were even more bewildering. Not only had Clayton taken out additional coverage on both of our lives, but he'd also changed the beneficiaries on our existing policies. I was no longer the primary beneficiary of his life insurance. Instead, the money would go to something called the Shaw Family Trust, an entity that had been established 6 months earlier with legal documents I'd never seen. I was listed as a secondary beneficiary of this trust, but the language was so complex that I couldn't determine what that actually meant for my financial security if something happened to Clayton. What I could understand was that someone named Trustee S. Gray had significant control over how the trust funds would be distributed. S. Gray, Savannah Gray. The name appeared in several documents, always in connection with financial arrangements. I didn't understand. She was listed as a business consultant for one of Clayton's new companies. She was co-signatory on an investment account that had been opened just 4 months earlier. Most shocking of all, she was the designated emergency contact for several of our most important financial institutions. My hands were shaking as I continued reading. Here was documentary evidence that my husband had not only been making major financial decisions without my input, but he'd been systematically removing me from positions of control over assets I'd assumed were jointly owned. Worse, he'd been inserting another woman into those positions, giving Savannah Gray access to our financial life that even I didn't possess. I found myself sitting in Clayton's leather chair, surrounded by papers that revealed a parallel financial reality I'd been completely unaware of. While I'd been focused on managing our household, planning dinner parties, and maintaining the social connections that supported Clayton's business reputation, he'd been quietly restructuring our entire financial future, and apparently building a significant portion of it around another woman. The betrayal was stunning, but what left me truly breathless was the realization of my own ignorance. How had I allowed myself to become so disconnected from our finances that my husband could make these kinds of changes without my knowledge? When had I stopped asking questions about our investments, our insurance, our long-term planning? When had I become so trusting that I'd essentially handed over control of my financial future to someone who was clearly planning a future that didn't include me? I thought about all the times Clayton had dismissed my questions about money with phrases like, "Don't worry your pretty head about it," or "I've got everything under control." I remembered how he'd always handled the meetings with our financial advisor alone, claiming it was more efficient than trying to coordinate both of our schedules. I recalled the way he'd slowly but consistently excluded me from financial conversations, suggesting that I focus on what I was good at while he handled the complicated business stuff. For decades, I'd interpreted his financial management as a form of care, a way of protecting me from stress and complexity. Now I understood it had been a form of control, a systematic process of ensuring that I remained dependent on him for security, while he maintained complete freedom to make decisions that affected both of our futures. The worst part was recognizing how willingly I'd participated in my own financial disenfranchisement. I'd been so grateful to be taken care of, so comfortable with the traditional division of labor in our marriage, that I'd essentially signed away my agency over my own economic well-being. As I sat in that office, surrounded by evidence of Clayton's deception, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine anger. Not the polite irritation I'd learned to express when small things went wrong, but deep, burning rage at being betrayed so systematically and for so long. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, returned everything to its proper place, and locked the office door behind me. Clayton wouldn't return from his conference for 2 days, which gave me time to figure out what to do with this information. But even as I tried to process the financial implications of what I'd discovered, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. If Clayton had been lying about our investments and insurance, if he'd been giving another woman control over our financial affairs, what else didn't I know about my own life? The woman who had opened that envelope from Henderson and Associates, that morning was still Clayton's trusting wife, still operating under the assumption that their marriage was solid, even if it wasn't passionate. The woman who locked his office door that afternoon was someone entirely different, someone who had finally seen behind the carefully constructed facade and didn't like what she'd found. That night, for the first time in our 42-year marriage, I was grateful that Clayton wasn't home. I needed time to think, to plan, and to figure out who I was going to become now that I knew who I'd really been married to all along. The 2 days Clayton spent at his conference gave me the opportunity to become a detective in my own life. What had started as shock over financial documents had evolved into a systematic investigation of my marriage, and what I discovered was a pattern of deception so extensive that I wondered how I'd been blind to it for so long. Armed with my newfound determination to understand the truth about our relationship, I began examining everything with fresh eyes. Phone bills, credit card statements, travel receipts, even the seemingly innocent calendar Clayton kept on his desk. Everything became potential evidence of a life I'd been excluded from understanding. The phone records were the first to reveal disturbing patterns. Clayton had always carried 2 phones, his personal cell and what he called his business line, claiming that keeping work and personal calls separate was essential for tax purposes and professional boundaries. I'd never questioned this arrangement, just as I'd never questioned so many of his organizational systems that seemed designed to keep different aspects of his life in separate compartments. But as I studied the billing statements for both phones, a troubling picture emerged. The business phone showed hundreds of calls to the same number over the past 2 years, often lasting an hour or more. The frequency had increased dramatically over recent months, with daily calls becoming the norm, rather than the exception. These weren't the brief, efficient conversations I'd expect from professional consultations. They were the extended, intimate discussions of people who had a lot to talk about beyond business. When I reverse-searched the number online, my suspicions were confirmed. It belonged to Savannah Gray. The timing of these calls was perhaps even more revealing than their frequency. Many occurred during hours when Clayton was supposedly at the office, but the conversations were clearly personal rather than professional. Others happened late in the evening, after I'd gone to bed, or early in the morning before I woke up. He'd been maintaining what amounted to a secret relationship, conducted in the margins of our daily life, hidden in plain sight behind the facade of business necessity. Credit card statements told their own story of deception. While I managed our household budget and paid for groceries, utilities, and day-to-day expenses from our joint checking account, Clayton handled what he called major purchases and business expenses. With credit cards, I rarely saw the statements. I'd trusted him to manage these accounts responsibly, assuming they were used for legitimate business purposes and occasional large purchases for our home. The reality was far different. Over the past 18 months, those business credit cards had been used to pay for restaurant meals at romantic establishments during hours when Clayton claimed to be in client meetings. There were charges for weekend hotel stays in neighboring cities, always for 2 people, during periods when I thought he was attending professional conferences alone. Most damning were the purchases from jewelry stores, florists, and boutique shops, the kind of thoughtful gifts that had once been reserved for our anniversary and my birthday, but were now being lavished on someone else. The travel receipts were equally illuminating. Clayton's business trips had indeed become more frequent over the past 2 years, but the destinations and timing suggested something beyond professional necessity. Weekend conferences in romantic mountain towns, industry seminars in wine country, training sessions at lakeside resorts, all locations that seemed more suited to romantic getaways than business development. When I cross-referenced these trips, with the phone records, I found that Savannah had also been traveling during many of the same periods, often to cities within driving distance of Clayton's supposed business destinations. They'd been taking vacations together while I believed my husband was working to secure our financial future. Perhaps most painfully, I discovered that our own social calendar had been manipulated to accommodate Clayton's double life. Events I thought we'd skipped due to scheduling conflicts or lack of interest had actually been carefully avoided, because they would have interfered with his plans with Savannah. Dinner parties I'd been told were canceled had proceeded without us, leaving me isolated from friendships while Clayton maintained his secret relationship. I found evidence of canceled subscriptions to activities I'd enjoyed. Season tickets to the theater, membership in the Historical Society, even my monthly book club fees, all supposedly eliminated for budget reasons while Clayton was spending lavishly on his parallel life. He'd been systematically cutting me off from my own interests and social connections, claiming financial necessity while funding elaborate romantic gestures for another woman. The pattern that emerged was one of deliberate isolation and control. Clayton hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been methodically preparing for a life without me while ensuring I remained financially and socially dependent on him. Every canceled subscription, every declined invitation, every business trip had been part of a larger strategy to minimize my independent connections while maximizing his freedom to pursue his relationship with Savannah. What struck me most, forcefully, was recognizing how actively I'd participated in my own isolation. When Clayton suggested we skip the Hendersons' anniversary party because he was too exhausted from work, I'd agreed without question. When he recommended canceling our theater subscription because the evening performances interfered with his early morning schedule, I'd gone along with his reasoning. When he gradually stopped inviting me to business social events, claiming they'd become too political and boring for someone with my interests, I'd felt relieved rather than excluded. I'd been so well trained to defer to his judgment, so accustomed to prioritizing his comfort and preferences, that I'd willingly participated in my own marginalization. Every time I'd agreed to his suggestions for the sake of marital harmony, I'd been unknowingly facilitating his preparation for a future that didn't include me. The calendar on Clayton's desk revealed the most detailed timeline of his deception. While I'd been planning our social obligations around his stated schedule, he'd been maintaining a completely different calendar that showed his real priorities. Appointments marked SG consultation appeared regularly during times when I thought he was meeting with established clients. Weekend retreat, professional development entries coincided with periods when I'd been told he needed quiet time at home to prepare for important presentations. Most devastating was discovering that our own 42nd wedding anniversary had been overshadowed by a romantic weekend getaway Clayton had taken with Savannah just 1 week later. While I'd been treasuring the simple dinner we'd shared at home, Clayton had claimed he was too busy with work for anything elaborate. He'd been planning an extravagant celebration with his lover at a resort I'd always dreamed of visiting. The evidence painted a picture of a man who had been living a completely double life for at least 2 years, possibly longer. But more than that, it revealed the systematic way he'd manipulated our marriage to accommodate his infidelity, while ensuring I remained unaware and financially vulnerable. As I sat surrounded by this documentation of betrayal, I felt a strange combination of devastation and clarity. The devastation was obvious. Discovering that my marriage had been a carefully maintained fiction was heartbreaking. But the clarity was unexpected and empowering. For the first time in decades, I was seeing my life without illusions, understanding exactly what I was dealing with, and recognizing that I had choices to make about my future. The woman who had accidentally opened that envelope from Henderson and Associates 3 days earlier had been living in ignorance, trusting in a relationship that existed more in her imagination than in reality. The woman sitting in Clayton's office now, surrounded by evidence of his systematic deception, was someone entirely different, someone who finally understood the truth about her marriage and was ready to decide what to do about it. I carefully returned everything to its proper place, but not before making copies of the most damning evidence. Clayton would return from his conference the next evening, and I needed to be prepared for the conversation that would inevitably follow my discoveries. But first, I had some decisions to make about who I wanted to be and what kind of future I was willing to accept. Clayton returned from his conference on Friday evening with his usual efficiency, arriving precisely at 6:30 p.m. as he'd indicated in his text message that morning. I heard his car in the driveway, the familiar sound of his keys at the front door, his measured footsteps as he placed his briefcase in the hallway closet and hung his coat on its designated hook. After 42 years of marriage, these sounds had become the background rhythm of my life, as predictable as a metronome. But everything felt different now. I was in the kitchen, standing at the island where I'd prepared thousands of meals over the decades. But instead of cooking dinner, I was simply waiting. The evidence of Clayton's deception was safely hidden in my bedroom, photographed and documented, but the knowledge of it had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I felt like I was wearing a mask of my former self, playing the role of dutiful wife while underneath, someone entirely different was taking shape. "Eliza?" Clayton called out, his voice carrying the expectant tone of a man accustomed to being greeted warmly after business trips. "I'm home, in the kitchen," I replied, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie with one hand while checking his phone with the other. At 67, Clayton was still handsome in the way that successful men often are, well-groomed, confident, carrying himself with the assurance of someone who'd spent decades having his expectations met. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit expensive and well-tailored, his expression holding that slight satisfaction of a man returning to his well-ordered domestic life. "Conference went well," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek, in the perfunctory way that had replaced genuine affection years ago. "Some excellent networking opportunities. I think we might see some new business from the connections I made." The casual lies came so easily to him. I wondered how many other conferences had actually been romantic getaways with Savannah. How many networking opportunities had been elaborate deceptions designed to cover his tracks. "That's wonderful," I heard myself say. The words automatic, after decades of providing appropriate responses to his updates. "Are you hungry? I could make something for dinner." It was the same conversation we'd had hundreds of times before, but now I was hyper-aware of every word, every gesture, every assumption that underlay our interaction. Clayton expected to be fed. He expected his homecoming to be treated as the most important event of my day. He expected me to be grateful for his presence, interested in his activities, ready to resume my role as the supportive wife who made his life comfortable and predictable. But as I stood there, looking at this man, who had been systematically betraying me while expecting me to maintain the fiction of our happy marriage, something inside me snapped. "Actually," I said, setting down the dish towel I'd been holding, "I have other plans tonight." Clayton looked up from his phone, surprise flickering across his features. In 42 years of marriage, I had never, not once, told him I had other plans when he returned from a business trip. My plans, such as they were, had always been flexible, secondary to his schedule and needs. "Other plans?" he repeated, as if the words didn't quite make sense in this context. "I'm going out," I said simply. "There's leftover soup in the refrigerator, if you're hungry." The confusion on his face was almost comical. This was so far outside our established patterns that he seemed genuinely unable to process what was happening. Clayton was a man who liked order, predictability, systems that worked efficiently. A wife who announced independent plans without consultation was not part of any system he recognized. "Going out where?" he asked, his tone shifting from confusion to something approaching concern. "With whom? You didn't mention any plans this morning." The questions revealed so much about the dynamics of our marriage. When had I started needing permission to leave the house? When had my social life become something that required his advance approval? When had I stopped being a person with independent desires and become a household fixture that was expected to be available whenever needed? "I'm meeting Kennedy Hayes for dinner," I said, naming the one friend from my pottery class who had consistently invited me to social events despite my usual excuses about Clayton's schedule. "She's been asking me to join her for weeks, and tonight seems like a good time." This was technically true. Kennedy had indeed been inviting me to various activities, and I had been declining because they conflicted with Clayton's expectations of my availability. But I hadn't actually called Kennedy yet. That conversation would happen from the car, after I left, if she was free. If not, I would eat dinner alone at a restaurant, something I had never done in my entire adult life. Clayton's expression was shifting from confusion to irritation. "Eliza, I just got back from 3 days away. I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, just the two of us. Can't you reschedule with Kennedy for another time?" The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could hear the underlying assumption that my plans were always less important than his preferences, that my friendships were optional while his comfort was essential, that a quiet evening at home was something I should want as much as he did. "No," I said, the word coming out more firmly than I'd intended. "I can't reschedule. I've already committed to going." Clayton stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "This isn't like you, Eliza. Are you feeling all right? You seem different." Different. Yes, I was different. I was a woman who had discovered that her husband had been living a double life for years, stealing from their joint assets to fund a relationship with another woman, systematically isolating her from friends and activities while planning a future that didn't include her. I was different because I was finally awake. "I'm fine," I said, walking past him toward the hallway. "Better than fine, actually. I'll be back later this evening." I could feel him watching me as I retrieved my purse and car keys, his confusion palpable. This small act of independence, dinner with a friend without his permission or participation, was earth-shattering in the context of our marriage. It violated every unspoken rule we'd established about how our evenings were supposed to unfold. Who made decisions about our social calendar? Whose needs took priority? "Eliza," he called after me as I headed for the door. "We should talk when you get back. Something's obviously bothering you." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Something was bothering me. A lifetime of diminishing myself, of accepting less than I deserved, of trusting a man who had been systematically betraying that trust while I maintained the beautiful home and social facade that supported his reputation. "Yes," I agreed. "We should definitely talk when I get back." As I drove away from our house in Pinehurst Heights, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that reminded me of the first time I'd driven alone as a teenager. The familiar streets looked different somehow, as if I was seeing them through new eyes. I was 64 years old, and I was choosing my own destination for the first time in decades. Kennedy was indeed free for dinner, delighted to finally have me accept one of her invitations. We met at a small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of place Clayton would have dismissed as too casual or too noisy for his tastes. But I loved everything about it. The checkered tablecloths, the warm lighting, the way Kennedy's eyes lit up when I told her I was ready to start living differently. "I've been waiting for this moment," she said, raising her wine glass in a toast. "I could see there was more to you than the perfect wife routine. I'm excited to meet the real Eliza." As we talked and laughed over pasta and wine, I realized I was excited to meet her too. For the first time in years, I was having a conversation about my own thoughts, my own interests, my own dreams for the future. Kennedy didn't ask about Clayton's work or our plans as a couple. She wanted to know what I was reading, what I thought about the world, what made me happy. When I finally returned home at nearly 10 p.m., Clayton was waiting in the living room, his expression a mixture of concern, and barely controlled irritation. The quiet evening he'd expected had been disrupted, and his carefully ordered world felt slightly off balance. "We need to talk," he said before I'd even set down my purse. "Yes," I agreed, feeling stronger than I had in years. "We certainly do. But for the first time in our marriage, I would be entering that conversation as an equal participant rather than a supporting player." The woman who had left the house that evening was someone Clayton didn't recognize. The woman who had returned was someone I was just beginning to discover myself. The conversation that night with Clayton was a masterclass in deflection and manipulation, though I was finally equipped to recognize it as such. He approached my evening out with the same methodical analysis he applied to business problems, trying to identify the source of my unusual behavior so he could address it efficiently and restore our normal routine. "You seem stressed lately," he said, settling into his leather recliner with the air of a man prepared to solve a manageable domestic issue. "Maybe you should consider seeing Dr. Morrison about adjusting your hormone replacement therapy. These kinds of mood swings can be a sign that your body chemistry needs rebalancing." It was a perfect example of the way Clayton had always handled any deviation from my expected behavior, by pathologizing it, suggesting that my feelings were symptoms, to be treated rather than valid responses to actual circumstances. For decades, I'd accepted this framework, allowing him to convince me that my occasional dissatisfaction was a personal failing rather than a reasonable reaction to being diminished and controlled. But tonight, armed with knowledge of his systematic deception, I could see the manipulation clearly. "I'm not having mood swings," I said calmly. "I'm having realizations." He frowned, clearly hoping for a more manageable explanation. "What kind of realizations?" I looked at this man I'd been married to for 42 years, this person I'd thought I knew completely, and felt a strange sense of liberation. The old Eliza would have backed down, apologized for being difficult, found a way to smooth over the conflict and return to our comfortable patterns. But the old Eliza hadn't known about the secret phone calls, the hidden financial accounts, the systematic lies that had been funding his relationship with another woman. "I'm realizing that I've spent most of my adult life being someone I'm not," I said. "And I'm curious about who I might be if I stopped trying to be the person you need me to be." Clayton's expression shifted to the particular kind of patronizing concern he'd perfected over the years. "Eliza, you're talking like you're having some kind of identity crisis. This is probably normal for women your age, but it doesn't mean you need to make dramatic changes. We have a good life together. Why would you want to disrupt that?" Why indeed? Because good had become a prison I'd been too comfortable to escape. Because together had apparently been a fiction maintained for my benefit while he built a real relationship with someone else. Because our life had actually been his life, with me serving as an attractive and efficient supporting player. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Instead, I simply said, "I'd like to explore some new interests, maybe take some classes, develop some hobbies that are just mine." Over the next few weeks, I began doing exactly that. The pottery class with Kennedy became a twice-weekly commitment, and I discovered I had a genuine talent for working with clay. There was something deeply satisfying about shaping something beautiful from raw material, creating objects that were purely the product of my own vision and effort. Through Kennedy, I met other women who were rediscovering themselves at various stages of life. There was Riley Morris, a recent widow who had started painting landscapes at 62 and was now selling her work at local galleries. Summer Wright had left a 30-year career in banking to become a massage therapist, finding more fulfillment in healing work than she'd ever experienced in corporate finance. Taylor Evans had returned to college at 59 to finish the degree she'd abandoned when she got married, and was now working as a victim's advocate. These women became my unofficial mentors in the art of late-life reinvention. They shared stories of marriages that had ended, careers that had been abandoned and then reclaimed, dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. Most importantly, they showed me that it was possible to start over, even after decades of living according to someone else's script. The hardest part, Riley told me one evening as we cleaned our pottery wheels, is giving yourself permission to want something different. We're so trained to be grateful for what we have, to not rock the boat, to put everyone else's needs first. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, what do I want? Not what should I want, not what would make other people happy, but what would make me feel alive? What would make me feel alive? It was a question I hadn't asked myself in so long that I'd almost forgotten it was possible to ask it. I started small. I joined a book club that met on Thursday evenings, something Clayton initially objected to because it interfered with our usual routine of watching the news together and discussing his day. When I explained that I would be missing our evening routine regularly, not just occasionally, he suggested I record the discussions so we could listen to them together later. That defeats the purpose, I explained. The value is in participating, in real-time conversation with other people about ideas. He looked at me as if I'd suggested taking up skydiving. But we have good conversations about books. You can discuss whatever you're reading with me. The assumption that his opinion was an adequate substitute for a diverse group of perspectives was so perfectly Clayton that I almost laughed. It's not the same thing, I said simply, and enrolled in the book club despite his continued puzzlement. I also started volunteering at the Literacy Center downtown, teaching reading skills to adults who were working toward their GEDs. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways I hadn't experienced since my brief teaching career 4 decades earlier. My students were motivated and grateful, and helping them discover the power of education reminded me of dreams I'd set aside so long ago I'd almost forgotten they existed. Clayton's reaction to my new activities was tellingly revealing. He didn't object directly. That would have been too obviously controlling. But he found subtle ways to express disapproval and create obstacles. He scheduled dinner parties on evenings when he knew I had commitments, then expressed disappointment when I chose to honor my prior obligations. He complained about feeling abandoned when I spent Saturday afternoons at the Literacy Center instead of accompanying him to the hardware store or garden center. Most manipulatively, he began having what he called episodes of mild chest pain or dizziness on days when I had plans, requiring my attention and care. These episodes always resolved quickly once I'd canceled my activities to stay home with him, and they never occurred when he had his own social or business commitments. But I was no longer the woman who would sacrifice her own interests at the first sign of Clayton's distress. Instead, I suggested he see his doctor about these concerning symptoms, offered to drive him to urgent care, and recommended he consider wearing a medical alert device if his health was becoming unpredictable. "It's probably nothing serious," he would say when faced with the prospect of actual medical attention. "I just need to rest. I hate for you to go out when I'm not feeling well." "Then you should definitely see Dr. Patterson," I would reply cheerfully. It's important to rule out any cardiac issues at our age. The episodes stopped happening once it became clear they wouldn't achieve their intended effect. Meanwhile, my new activities were opening up parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. In the book club, I found myself expressing opinions I hadn't known I held, engaging in debates that stretched my thinking, discovering authors and ideas that excited me in ways I hadn't experienced in years. At the Literacy Center, I was valued for my skills and knowledge rather than my ability to support someone else's goals. Most surprisingly, through pottery class, I was developing an artistic voice that was entirely my own. My pieces were becoming more sophisticated, more personal, more expressive of something I couldn't quite name but recognized as authentically mine. When Kennedy suggested I enter a piece in the County Arts Festival, I felt a flutter of excitement. That reminded me of being young and full of possibilities. "You're different," Clayton observed one evening as I prepared to leave for book club. "I'm not sure I like these changes." "I'm becoming myself," I replied, checking my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was someone I was just beginning to recognize. More confident, more purposeful, more present in her own life. "You were always yourself," Clayton protested. "You were perfect the way you were. Perfect for him, perhaps. Perfectly supportive, perfectly accommodating, perfectly invisible when it came to my own needs and desires." But perfection, I was learning, was a trap that had kept me from becoming the person I was meant to be. "I was who I thought you needed me to be," I corrected gently. "Now I'm discovering who I actually am underneath all those expectations." As I drove to book club that evening, I thought about the question Riley had posed. What would make me feel alive? For the first time in decades, I was beginning to find out. The turning point came 6 weeks after I'd started my new routine of pottery classes, book club, and volunteer work. Clayton announced that he would be attending another 3-day conference, this one in the mountain resort town of Ashford Springs, about 4 hours north of Millbrook. The timing was perfect, he explained, because it would allow him to combine professional development with some much-needed relaxation in a scenic setting. "The conference is at the Grand Pine Resort," he said, showing me the registration materials with the same transparency he'd always used to maintain the fiction of his business travel. "Beautiful location, excellent speakers. I'm really looking forward to it." But this time, instead of simply accepting his explanation and planning my own quiet weekend at home, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I waited until Clayton left early Friday morning, then called the Grand Pine Resort. Directly, speaking with the concierge, I explained that my husband was attending a conference there and I wanted to send him a surprise gift basket. "I'm sorry," the young woman said after checking their system, "but we don't have any conferences scheduled this weekend. Are you sure about the dates?" My stomach dropped, but I pressed on. "Perhaps it's a small group meeting. The name would be Clayton Shaw, and it's related to accounting or financial planning." Another pause, more keyboard clicking. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Shaw, but we don't have any guest by that name registered for this weekend either." I thanked her and hung up, my hands trembling slightly. The lie was so blatant, so easily disproven, that it revealed a level of contempt for my intelligence that was almost breathtaking. Clayton hadn't even bothered to construct a plausible deception. He'd simply assumed I would never think to verify his story. But if he wasn't at the Grand Pine Resort, where was he? The answer came to me as I remembered the pattern I'd discovered in his credit card statements. Clayton's romantic getaways with Savannah had consistently been to upscale destinations within a few hours' drive of Millbrook. Ashford Springs was exactly the kind of place they would choose for a weekend retreat. Scenic, sophisticated, and far enough away to minimize the chance of running into anyone who knew us. I called 4 different hotels in Ashford Springs, using the same story about wanting to send a gift basket. The third hotel, the Mountain View Inn, confirmed what I suspected. "Oh yes, Mr. Shaw checked in yesterday evening," the desk clerk said cheerfully. "He's in our honeymoon suite. Would you like me to connect you to his room?" The honeymoon suite. The audacity was stunning. "Actually," I said, thinking quickly, "I'd prefer to surprise him. Could you tell me if he's dining at the hotel restaurant tonight? I might drive up to join him." "Let me check with our concierge," she said, putting me on hold. When she returned, her voice was slightly apologetic. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Shaw has dinner reservations for 2 at our rooftop restaurant tonight at 8 p.m. It sounds like he's already expecting company." I'm sure he was. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, processing what I'd just learned. Clayton wasn't just lying about business conferences. He was actively planning romantic weekends with Savannah while maintaining the pretense of our marriage. The honeymoon suite reservation was particularly cruel, a mockery of the commitment we'd supposedly shared for 42 years. But rather than collapse into despair, I felt a surge of cold determination. If Clayton could play detective games with our marriage, so could I. And I had advantages he didn't know about. I knew the truth about his deception, while he still believed I was the trusting, naive wife who would never question his stories. Over. The next few weeks, I became methodical in my investigation. I started by creating a comprehensive timeline of Clayton's business trips over the past 2 years, cross-referencing them with his credit card statements and phone records. The pattern that emerged was damning in its consistency. Every supposed conference coincided with romantic charges on his credit cards, expensive dinners for two, spa treatments, florists, jewelry stores. Every business trip to a city with multiple hotels showed charges only to the most romantic and luxurious establishments. Every weekend, professional development retreat included purchases that had nothing to do with accounting or financial planning and everything to do with impressing a woman. I also began tracking Savannah's social media presence, something I'd never thought to do before. Her Facebook and Instagram accounts were set to private, but her professional LinkedIn profile was public, and it told its own story. Her work history showed frequent consulting projects in locations that perfectly matched Clayton's business travel destinations. She'd been consulting in the same mountain resort town where Clayton had attended a conference just 2 weeks earlier. More telling were the photos on her public Pinterest boards. Savannah had been collecting images of wedding venues, engagement, rings, and romantic getaway destinations with increasing frequency over the past year. One board was titled Second Chances and featured pictures of older couples in wedding attire, destination wedding locations, and home decor that suggested she was planning a complete lifestyle change. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. While organizing paperwork in our home office, Clayton's former sanctuary that I now had regular access to during his business trips, I discovered a hidden folder tucked behind our tax documents. Inside were printouts of real estate listings, all for properties in Savannah's name. She had purchased a house 6 months earlier, a charming cottage on Maple Street in the historic district of Millbrook. The purchase price was $340,000, and according to the paperwork, she'd paid cash. The timing aligned perfectly with the mysterious withdrawals from our retirement accounts that I'd discovered months earlier. Clayton had been using our joint assets to help Savannah purchase a love nest where they could conduct their relationship, away from the scrutiny of our social circle. While I'd been budgeting carefully and declining social activities for supposed financial reasons, my husband had been spending our retirement savings to set up housekeeping with another woman. The property listing described it as a perfect starter home for a couple looking to downsize and simplify their lifestyle. The photos showed a cozy 2-bedroom cottage with a modern kitchen, a romantic garden, and enough space for 2 people who wanted to live quietly together. It was everything Clayton had never wanted in our marriage: small, intimate, unpretentious. But apparently exactly what he desired for his relationship with Savannah. I also discovered correspondence between Clayton and a divorce attorney, dated 3 months earlier. The consultation had been about optimal strategies for asset division in long-term marriages and protecting business interests during marital dissolution. Clayton had been planning our divorce while I remained completely unaware that our marriage was in jeopardy. The attorney's notes, which Clayton had apparently kept for reference, were brutally calculating. They discussed ways to minimize his financial obligations to me, strategies for claiming that I'd been a non-contributing spouse, despite 42 years of managing our household and supporting his career, and methods for protecting assets he considered his individual property rather than marital assets. Most chilling was a section about establishing separate residence and financial independence as preparation for divorce proceedings. Clayton hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been methodically preparing to abandon our marriage while ensuring that I would be left with as little as possible. The investigation also revealed the extent to which he'd been manipulating our social relationships. I found evidence that he'd been declining social invitations on our behalf, telling friends and acquaintances that I was going through a difficult time and preferred to stay home. He'd been systematically isolating me from our mutual friends while maintaining his own social connections, creating a narrative that would support his eventual claim that our marriage had deteriorated due to my withdrawal from social activities. The time I'd assembled all this evidence, I had a complete picture of Clayton's deception that was staggering in its scope and cruelty. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been conducting a comprehensive campaign to dismantle our marriage while positioning himself for a comfortable transition to a new life with Savannah. The financial theft, the emotional manipulation, the systematic lies, the preparation for divorce. All of it painted a picture of a man who had been treating our marriage as a business venture to be liquidated when a better opportunity presented itself. But perhaps most importantly, my investigation had revealed something else: my own capacity for strategic thinking and decisive action. The woman who had stumbled across that financial planning letter months ago had been passive, confused, and dependent on others for guidance. The woman who had just compiled a comprehensive dossier of her husband's betrayal was someone entirely different, sharp, focused, and ready to take control of her own destiny. Clayton thought he was playing chess while I played checkers. He was about to discover how wrong he was. As I organized my evidence into 3 distinct categories: financial theft, relationship deception, and divorce preparation, I realized that each category told its own story of betrayal, and each one would play a crucial role in the confrontation that was inevitably coming. I just needed to choose the right moment and the right venue to reveal what I'd learned. Clayton had been planning a surprise of his own, but I was about to show him that 2 could play the game of shocking revelations. The difference was, mine would be backed by documented proof rather than elaborate fiction. The 3 bank statements that would ultimately destroy Clayton's wedding came into my possession through a combination of careful investigation and pure accident. By this point, I had been systematically documenting his deception for 2 months, building a comprehensive case that revealed the true scope of his betrayal. But it was the arrival of these specific statements, all on the same day, that provided the final pieces of evidence I needed to understand the complete picture of what he had done to our marriage and our financial future. The first statement arrived in our regular mail, forwarded from our old address. It was from an account I'd never heard of, Shaw Holdings LLC, with a return address that listed Clayton as the sole member and managing partner. The account showed regular deposits over the past 18 months, all from sources that appeared to be connected to our joint investments and retirement funds. But the withdrawals told a different story entirely. Large sums had been systematically transferred to accounts belonging to Savannah Gray, often with memo lines that read, "consulting," fees or business expenses. Other withdrawals were made directly to vendors I recognized from my investigation. The jewelry store where Clayton had purchased Savannah's engagement ring, the travel agency that had booked their romantic getaways, the real estate company that had handled the purchase of Savannah's cottage. Most devastating were the recent withdrawals labeled wedding expenses. Over the past 3 months, Clayton had spent nearly $75,000 from this hidden account on what appeared to be elaborate wedding preparations. Payments to the chapel, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, all the vendors who would be providing services for his marriage to Savannah while he was still legally married to me. The second statement was even more damaging. It arrived by overnight delivery, sent to me personally by a bank I'd never heard of. The accompanying letter explained that they were updating their records and needed to confirm my contact information as the secondary account holder on a joint investment account. Joint investment account? I had never opened a joint account with anyone except Clayton, and certainly not at Millbrook Community Bank. But according to the statement, I was listed as the co-owner of an account that held over $400,000 in various investments, money that appeared to have been transferred from our legitimate retirement accounts over the past 2 years. The truly shocking part was discovering that while I was listed as a co-owner, I had never signed any paperwork to establish this account, never received statements or updates, and had never authorized any of the transactions. Someone had forged my signature and created fraudulent documentation to establish this account. then used it as a staging area for transferring our marital assets into investments that would be harder to trace and easier to claim as separate. Property and divorce proceedings. The investment portfolio in this account was heavily weighted toward risky ventures and startup companies, exactly the kind of investments Clayton knew I would never approve of. But more importantly, the account was structured in a way that would make it appear as though I had been an active participant in high-risk investment decisions, potentially affecting my credibility in any future divorce proceedings. The third statement was the most personally devastating of all. It came from our original bank, the one where we'd maintained our primary accounts for over 30 years. But this wasn't our familiar joint checking or savings account. This was a statement for Clayton's personal account, one I'd never known existed, and it had been sent to me by mistake due to what the bank later explained was a computer error in their mailing system. This account revealed the most intimate details of Clayton's relationship with Savannah. Monthly transfers labeled household allowance showed that he'd been providing her with $3,000 per month for over a year, more than I received for managing our entire household budget. Regular payments to her credit cards, her car loan, her health insurance premiums, and even her gym membership showed that he'd been completely supporting her lifestyle while claiming we needed to tighten our budget at home. But it was the pattern of smaller purchases that painted the most detailed picture of their relationship. Weekly charges at romantic restaurants, monthly spa treatments, regular purchases from lingerie boutiques and perfume counters, all the thoughtful gestures and intimate gifts that had gradually disappeared from our marriage as Clayton claimed. We needed to be more financially responsible. The statement also showed payments for what appeared to be couples counseling sessions. Clayton and Savannah had been attending relationship therapy together, working on their communication and planning their future, while he told me that our marriage problems were too minor to require professional intervention. Most cruelly, the account showed regular payments to a wedding planner starting 6 months earlier, at exactly the time when Clayton had suggested we should consider a trial separation to work on ourselves individually. While I'd been hoping the separation might help us reconnect as a couple, he'd been actively planning to marry someone else. These 3 statements, arriving within hours of each other, provided a complete financial timeline of Clayton's betrayal. They showed not just that he'd been unfaithful, but that he'd been systematically stealing from our marriage to fund his relationship with Savannah. They proved that he'd been planning their wedding while discussing reconciliation with me. They revealed forgery, financial fraud, and a level of deception that went far beyond a simple affair. But perhaps most importantly, they provided me with the documentation I needed to take decisive action. I spent that evening organizing the statements, alongside all the other evidence I'd gathered over the past months: credit card receipts, phone records, travel documents, real estate transactions, legal consultations. Together, they painted a picture of a man who had been methodically dismantling our marriage while positioning himself for a comfortable transition to a new life. The financial theft alone was substantial enough to constitute criminal fraud. Clayton had forged my signature on investment documents, transferred marital assets to personal accounts, and used our joint funds to support another woman's lifestyle. But the emotional cruelty of planning his wedding to Savannah, while maintaining the pretense of working on our marriage, was what finally crystallized my determination to confront him publicly. That night, I received a call from my sister Quinn, who lived across the country and had always been my closest confidant. She was calling to check on how I was handling the separation, having no idea of the extent of Clayton's deception. "I've been worried about you," she said. "This whole separation thing seems so sudden. Are you sure it's what you want?" For the first time since discovering Clayton's betrayal, I told someone the complete truth. I shared everything: the hidden accounts, the forged signatures, the wedding planning, the systematic theft of our retirement savings. Quinn listened in stunned silence as I described the scope of what I'd uncovered. "Eliza," she said when I finished, "this isn't just infidelity. This is criminal fraud. You need to take this to the police immediately." I will, I assured her. But first, I'm going to make sure that everyone who's been invited to celebrate Clayton's new beginning understands exactly what they're really celebrating. Quinn was quiet for a moment. What are you planning to do? I looked at the three. Bank statements spread across my kitchen table, each one representing a different aspect of Clayton's betrayal. I'm going to let the truth speak for itself, at the most public moment possible. The wedding? The wedding, I confirmed. Clayton wants to start his new life with a celebration surrounded by everyone he cares about. I think they deserve to know what kind of man they're celebrating. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house, the house that would soon be sold to pay for Clayton's debts and deceptions, and felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. For months, I'd been the victim of an elaborate deception, manipulated and stolen from by the person I'd trusted most in the world. But now I held the power. I had the evidence, I had the knowledge, and I had the opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that would ensure Clayton could never again claim to be the innocent victim of a failed marriage. The 3 bank statements would be my weapons of choice. Each one told a different part of the story, and together they would demolish the fiction Clayton had been maintaining about our separation and his relationship with Savannah. In just 2 weeks, I would be standing in the back of St. Catherine's Chapel, watching my husband marry another woman with money he'd stolen from our marriage. But this time, I wouldn't be the powerless, abandoned wife he expected me to be. This time, I would be the woman with the truth, the evidence, and the courage to use both. The 2 weeks between discovering those final bank statements and Clayton's wedding to Savannah became the most transformative period of my entire adult life. It wasn't just that I was preparing to confront my husband's betrayal publicly. I was fundamentally reshaping who I was as a person, shedding the careful, accommodating persona I'd maintained for 42 years and discovering the strong, decisive woman who had been buried beneath decades of deference and self-denial. The physical transformation began almost immediately. For years, I'd dressed according to Clayton's preferences, favoring conservative styles in muted colors that he deemed appropriate for a woman of my age and position. My hair had been styled the same way for over a decade, a sensible bob that required minimal maintenance and never drew attention. My makeup routine was practically non-existent, limited to the bare minimum necessary for important social events. But as I prepared for what would essentially be my public debut as an independent woman, I decided it was time to look like someone who deserved to be taken seriously. My first stop was Kennedy's hair salon, where I asked for something completely different. I want to look like myself, I told the stylist, not like someone's idea of what I should look like. We settled on a shorter, more modern cut with subtle highlights that brought out the natural silver in my hair rather than trying to hide it. The result was striking. I looked younger, more confident, more present in my own skin. Next came a shopping trip with Kennedy and Summer Wright, my pottery classmate who had become something of a mentor in the art of reinvention. We went to stores I'd never shopped in before, places that catered to women who wanted to look professional and attractive without conforming to someone else's definition of age-appropriate dressing. I bought a navy blue dress that fit my figure, properly instead of hiding it, paired with a blazer that was tailored rather than boxy. I purchased shoes with actual heels, something I hadn't worn in years because Clayton claimed they made me tower over him at social events. I even bought new lingerie, not for anyone else's benefit, but because wearing beautiful things underneath. My clothes made me feel powerful in a way I hadn't experienced since I was young. But the physical changes were just the external manifestation of a much deeper transformation happening inside me. For months, I'd been rediscovering aspects of my personality that had been dormant for decades, but now I was actively cultivating the qualities I would need to handle the confrontation ahead. I started practicing assertiveness in small ways. When the bank teller tried to pressure me into opening a new credit card account, I said no firmly and didn't feel obligated to provide lengthy explanations for my decision. When the grocery store clerk questioned my choice to buy expensive organic vegetables, I simply said they were worth it to me and didn't apologize for my preferences. Most importantly, I began speaking my truth in conversations, even when it made other people uncomfortable. At book club, when we discussed a novel about a woman leaving an unhappy marriage, I shared my own thoughts about the courage required to start over later in life. At the literacy center, when one of my students asked about my own educational background, I talked honestly about the dreams I'd set aside and was now reconsidering. These conversations helped me articulate thoughts and feelings I'd been suppressing for years. The more I spoke about independence, self-determination, and the right to pursue happiness regardless of age, the more convinced I became that I deserved all of those things myself. I also began preparing practically for the life I would need to build after the wedding confrontation. I met with a financial advisor to understand exactly what my options would be once the extent of Clayton's fraud became public. Despite the substantial theft from our marital assets, I would still have enough to live comfortably if I made smart decisions about housing and lifestyle. I started looking at apartments, focusing on places that were mine alone, rather than spaces that would accommodate a couple. I visited small one-bedroom units with good natural light, perfect for someone who planned to spend time reading, creating pottery, and entertaining friends rather than hosting elaborate dinner parties for business associates. The apartment hunting process was both exhilarating and terrifying. I was 64 years old and had never lived alone in my entire adult life. The idea of choosing my own paint colors, arranging furniture according to my preferences, and creating a space that reflected my personality rather than our joint social status was both thrilling and overwhelming. But with each apartment I visited, I felt more confident that I could do this. I could create a life that was entirely my own design, free from the subtle and not-so-subtle control that had shaped every aspect of my existence for decades. I also began strengthening the relationships that would form the foundation of my new life. Kennedy and I started having weekly coffee dates where we talked about everything from politics to poetry to our plans for the future. Summer Wright introduced me to other women who had successfully reinvented themselves later in life, creating an informal support network of people who understood the challenges and rewards of starting over. Through the Literacy Center, I met Riley Morris, a former lawyer who had left her practice to become a social worker after her divorce. Riley became my unofficial advisor on the practical aspects of ending a long marriage, sharing insights about everything from finding good legal representation to managing the emotional ups and downs of major life transitions. The hardest part, Riley told me during one of our conversations, is trusting yourself to make good decisions after years of deferring to someone else's judgment. You'll second-guess yourself constantly at first, but eventually you'll realize that your instincts are actually quite good. They've just been suppressed for so long that they feel unfamiliar. She was right. As I made decisions about my hair, my clothes, my living situation, and my future plans, I discovered that I had strong preferences and good judgment when I allowed myself to exercise them. The woman emerging from decades of accommodation was someone I genuinely liked and respected. Perhaps most importantly, I began developing what I could only describe as a sense of righteous anger. For months, I'd felt hurt, confused, and betrayed by Clayton's deception. But as I prepared for the wedding confrontation, those emotions crystallized into something much more powerful, a clear-eyed fury at being treated with such systematic disrespect and cruelty. This wasn't the unfocused rage of someone lashing out in pain. This was the cold, determined anger of someone who had been systematically wronged and was prepared to demand accountability. Clayton had stolen from me financially, emotionally, and socially, all while maintaining the pretense that he was the devoted husband working to save our marriage. The anger felt clean and empowering in a way that the hurt and confusion never had. It gave me the energy I needed to plan my confrontation strategy and the confidence I needed to believe I could carry it out effectively. I also spent time rehearsing what I would say and how I would say it. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror, I practiced speaking clearly and calmly while presenting the evidence of Clayton's betrayal. I worked on projecting my voice so it would carry through the chapel, on maintaining my composure even if Clayton tried to discredit or dismiss me, and on presenting the facts in a way that would be impossible to deny or rationalize. The woman practicing those speeches in the mirror looked nothing like the accommodating wife who had accidentally discovered her husband's deception 6 months earlier. This woman stood straight, spoke with authority, and looked directly into the camera when she imagined addressing not just the wedding guests, but the wider community that would eventually learn about Clayton's fraud. As the wedding date approached, I felt a mixture of anticipation and calm that reminded me of how I'd felt before important exams in college, nervous about the specifics, but confident in my preparation and certain about my goals. I had transformed from someone who happened to things into someone who made things happen. From someone who accepted other people's definitions of her reality into someone who insisted on the truth. From someone who prioritized peace over justice into someone who understood that real peace could only come from standing up for herself. The woman who would walk into St. Catherine's Chapel in 3 days would bear little resemblance to the woman who had opened that letter from Henderson and Associates 6 months earlier. But she would be the most authentic version of Eliza Shaw, or perhaps Eliza King, that had existed in over 4 decades, and she would be ready to reclaim her life, one devastating revelation at a time. The morning of Clayton's wedding dawned, crisp and clear, the kind of perfect October day that seemed designed for new beginnings. I woke early in my temporary apartment. I had moved out of our house the week before, claiming I needed space to process our separation, and felt a sense of calm certainty that I hadn't experienced in months. Today was the day I would reclaim my power, my dignity, and my future. I dressed with the same careful attention I had once reserved for our most important social events, but this time, every choice was my own. The navy dress fit perfectly. Professional, yet striking. The blazer gave me an air of authority. The heels made me feel tall and confident. Most importantly, I carried a small leather portfolio containing copies of the 3 bank statements that would destroy Clayton's carefully constructed fiction. I arrived at St. Catherine's Chapel an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, parking across the street where I could observe the arrival of guests without being immediately noticed. From my vantage point, I watched as people I had known for decades filed into the church. Business associates who had attended dinner parties at our home, neighbors from Pinehurst Heights, members of the country club where Clayton and I had been fixtures for years. Many of these people believed they were attending the wedding of a man who had ended his marriage amicably and found love again with an old friend. They had no idea they were about to witness the public exposure of systematic fraud, theft, and deception that had been hidden behind Clayton's reputation as a respected member of the community. At exactly 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I walked across the street and entered the chapel through the side door. The interior was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements, white roses and baby's breath, elegant but understated, exactly the kind of tasteful display that Clayton preferred for important occasions. The irony that I recognized his aesthetic, preferences even in his wedding to another woman, was not lost on me. I took a seat in the back row, choosing an aisle seat that would give me easy access to the center of the church when the moment came. Several people turned to look at me with expressions of surprise and confusion. Word of our separation had circulated through our social circle, but most people assumed I would be too devastated or too dignified to attend Clayton's wedding to his lover. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were about what kind of woman I had become. The processional music began, and I watched as Clayton took his position at the altar. At 67, he looked distinguished in his charcoal gray tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture confident and assured. He was the picture of a successful man beginning a new chapter of his life, surrounded by people who respected and admired him. Beside him stood his best man, his business partner Wesley Ward, and two groomsmen I recognized as colleagues from his accounting firm. They all wore expressions of happiness for their friend who had found love again after his amicable separation from his wife of 42 years. When the bride's processional began, I felt my breath catch despite my preparation. Savannah Gray walked down the aisle in a cream-colored dress that was elegant and age-appropriate. Her auburn hair swept into an elaborate updo, her smile radiant with joy. She looked like a woman who believed she was marrying the love of her life, someone who had finally found her happily ever after. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Savannah had no idea that the man she was about to marry had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his wife to finance their relationship. She didn't know about the forged signatures, the hidden accounts, or the systematic fraud that had paid for everything from her engagement ring to the cottage where they planned to live. But my sympathy was overwhelmed by a surge of righteous anger as I remembered what this wedding represented. Clayton was using stolen money to celebrate his new beginning while claiming poverty in our divorce proceedings. He was presenting himself as a man of integrity while he had systematically defrauded the woman who had supported his career and maintained his home for over 4 decades. The ceremony proceeded with traditional elegance. Reverend Patterson spoke about love, commitment, and the courage required to begin again later in life. Clayton and Savannah exchanged personal vows that spoke of second chances, deep connection, and their excitement about building a future together. Do you, Clayton Shaw, take Savannah Gray to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Clayton replied, his voice strong and certain. Do you, Savannah Gray, take Clayton Shaw to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold for richer or poorer in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Savannah said, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. It was then that Reverend Patterson spoke the words I had been waiting for. If anyone has a reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. The traditional phrase was delivered with the expectation of silence, a ceremonial formality before the final vows. But as those words echoed through the chapel, I stood up slowly, deliberately, letting the rustle of my movement cut through the expectant quiet. Every head in the church turned toward me. I heard gasps of surprise, confused murmurs, the sharp intake of breath that indicated people were witnessing something unprecedented. Clayton's face went pale, his confident expression cracking into something approaching panic. Savannah looked bewildered, her gaze moving between me and the man she had just promised to marry. I do, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel's excellent acoustics. I have 3 very compelling reasons why this marriage should not proceed. I reached into my portfolio and withdrew the bank statements, holding them up so the congregation could see them even if they couldn't read the details from their seats. Before Clayton Shaw makes any more promises about commitment and integrity, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, I think everyone here should understand exactly how he has been financing this fairy tale romance. The silence that followed was absolute. 47 wedding guests sat frozen in their seats, their expressions ranging from confusion to horror as they tried to process what was happening. The photographer's camera clicked reflexively, capturing the moment when a wedding celebration became a public reckoning. Clayton found his voice first, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Eliza, what are you doing? This isn't the place. This is exactly the place, I interrupted, stepping into the aisle and walking toward the altar with measured steps. You chose to celebrate your new beginning in front of everyone you respect and care about. I think they deserve to know what they're really celebrating. I held up the first bank statement, speaking directly to the assembled guests rather than to Clayton. This is documentation of a secret account that my husband, who is still legally my husband by the way, has been using to systematically steal from our marital assets. Over $400,000 has been transferred from our joint retirement savings to fund his relationship with Ms. Gray. Gray. Murmurs of shock rippled through the congregation. Several people were leaning forward in their seats, straining to hear every word. Others were pulling out their phones, though whether to record the confrontation or call for help, I couldn't tell. I held up the second statement. This shows forged signatures on investment documents, creating accounts in my name without my knowledge or consent, and fraudulent transfers designed to hide assets during our divorce proceedings. Clayton had found his composure enough to take a step toward me, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Eliza, you're making a scene. If you have concerns about our financial arrangements, we can discuss them privately with our lawyers." "Our financial arrangements?" I repeated, my voice carrying a note of incredulous laughter. "Clayton, you've been stealing from me for 2 years to support another woman. There's nothing to discuss. There's only the truth to reveal." I held up the third statement, the most personally devastating of all. And this shows exactly how my husband has been spending our money. Monthly allowances to Ms. Gray that exceed what I received for managing our entire household. Payments for couples counseling, while he told me our problems were too minor for professional help. And wedding expenses, $75,000 spent on this very ceremony, all charged against accounts funded with money stolen from our marriage. The revelation hit the congregation like a physical blow. I could see the shock and disgust spreading across faces of people who had known and respected Clayton for years. Business associates were exchanging meaningful glances. Social acquaintances were whispering urgently to each other. Most importantly, I could see the dawning realization that the man they had come to celebrate was not who they thought he was. Savannah, to her credit, was staring at Clayton with growing horror. "Is this true?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the shocked murmurs. "Did you steal money from your wife to pay for our relationship?" Clayton's composure finally cracked completely. "It's not stealing," he said desperately. "It's my money too. We're getting divorced anyway." "We're getting divorced because you filed papers without warning me," I interjected. "Because you wanted to marry another woman. Because you had already decided to abandon our marriage while pretending to work on it." I turned to address the congregation directly, my voice clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here today believing you were celebrating love and new beginnings. Instead, you've witnessed the attempted marriage of a man who financed his romance through fraud, theft, and systematic deception. A man who forged his wife's signature on legal documents, stole her inheritance, and used marital assets to support another woman while claiming poverty in divorce proceedings." The chapel erupted in shocked conversation as people processed what they had heard. Several guests were already standing up, clearly uncomfortable with continuing to witness what had become a public exposure of criminal behavior rather than a wedding celebration. Clayton made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Everyone, please," he said, his voice pleading. "This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved privately. Eliza is obviously distraught about our separation and is lashing out." "I'm not lashing out," I said calmly, returning the bank statements to my portfolio. "I'm telling the truth. And now that everyone knows what kind of man you really are, I'll let you decide whether you still want to proceed with this ceremony." I turned and walked back down the aisle, my heels clicking on the marble floor in the absolute silence that followed my words. As I reached the back of the chapel, I heard Savannah's voice, loud and clear in the stunned quiet. "The wedding is over." The aftermath of what the local newspaper would later describe as the most dramatic wedding interruption in Millbrook's history unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even me. Within hours of my revelation at St. Catherine's Chapel, the story had spread throughout our social circle, then beyond into the wider community. By Monday morning, I had received calls from 3 different lawyers offering to represent me, 2 journalists requesting interviews, and Clayton's business partner asking if I would be willing to discuss the extent of my husband's financial improprieties. But perhaps most importantly, I received a call from Detective Austin Green of the Millbrook Police Department's White-Collar Crime Unit, who explained that several concerned citizens had contacted them about potential financial fraud that had been publicly disclosed during what was supposed to be a wedding ceremony. "Mrs. Shaw," he said in his professional but sympathetic tone, "we'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the documentation you referenced yesterday. If what you've described is accurate, we may be looking at multiple felony charges including fraud, forgery, and theft of marital assets." The meeting with Detective Green took place 3 days after the wedding that never was. I arrived at the CAW police station with my leather portfolio, now expanded to include not just the 3 original bank statements, but months of additional evidence I had compiled during my investigation. Riley Morris accompanied me, serving as both moral support and legal advisor until I could retain formal representation. Detective Green was a methodical man in his 40s who treated the financial documentation with the same careful attention that other investigators might give to physical evidence in a violent crime. He photographed each statement, made detailed notes about the timeline of transactions, and asked precise questions about my knowledge of and consent to various financial decisions. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases of marital financial fraud I've encountered," he told me after reviewing everything. "The systematic nature of the deception, combined with the forged signatures and fraudulent account creation, suggests this was a long-term strategy rather than impulsive behavior. The legal implications were staggering. Clayton faced potential charges for fraud, forgery, theft, and money laundering. The civil implications were equally serious. I would be entitled to full restitution of stolen funds, plus damages for the emotional and financial harm caused by his deception. But beyond the legal and financial consequences, the most profound changes were personal and social. Within a week of the chapel confrontation, I had been contacted by dozens of people from our community. Some were fellow victims of Clayton's financial services who wanted to discuss irregularities they had noticed in their own accounts. Others were women who shared their own stories of financial deception by trusted partners. Most surprisingly, many were people offering support, friendship, and admiration for my courage in speaking truth to power. Kennedy Hayes organized what she called a celebration of authentic living at her house the following weekend. The gathering included not just my pottery classmates and book club friends, but women from across Millbrook who had been inspired by my public stand against deception and abuse. We spent the evening sharing stories, offering mutual support, and discussing the ways women could protect themselves from financial manipulation. "What you did took incredible courage," Summer Wright told me as we sat on Kennedy's porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "You showed all of us that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, no matter how long you've been accepting less than you deserve." The social consequences for Clayton were immediate and severe. His business partnership with Wesley Ward was dissolved within days, as Ward worked frantically to distance himself from someone now facing criminal charges for financial fraud. Clayton's membership at the country club was suspended pending the outcome of legal proceedings. Former friends and business associates who had attended the wedding were now questioning every financial transaction they had ever conducted with him. Most dramatically, Savannah Gray had not only ended their relationship, but had also filed her own complaint with police about being deceived into participating in a romantic relationship funded by stolen money. She hired a lawyer to explore whether she could recover the money she had spent on the cottage, which she now understood had been purchased with funds fraudulently taken from my inheritance. The cottage on Maple Street, which Clayton had intended as his love nest with Savannah, was now evidence in a criminal case. The romantic garden where they had planned to spend their golden years together was cordoned off with police tape, while investigators documented the property that had been purchased with stolen funds. For me, the weeks following the chapel confrontation were a whirlwind of legal meetings, police interviews, and media attention. But underneath the chaos, I felt a profound sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time in my adult life, I was living completely according to my own values and priorities, without needing to consider how my choices would affect someone else's comfort or reputation. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in the historic district of Millbrook, a bright space with hardwood floors and tall windows that filled the rooms with natural light. The apartment was less than half the size of our house in Pinehurst Heights, but it felt infinitely more spacious because every corner reflected my own taste and preferences. I furnished it slowly and deliberately, choosing pieces that I genuinely loved rather than items that would impress visitors or coordinate with someone else's vision of appropriate decor. The living room centered around a comfortable reading chair positioned near the largest window, surrounded by bookshelves that held my rapidly expanding collection of novels, poetry, and books about art and creativity. The kitchen was compact but efficient, perfect for cooking simple meals for myself, or hosting intimate dinner parties with my growing circle of friends. I discovered that I actually enjoyed cooking when I was preparing food for people who appreciated both the effort and the company, rather than treating meal preparation as another household management task to be executed with minimum fuss. Most importantly, I converted the apartment's small second bedroom into an art studio where I could work on pottery projects at home. The space filled with afternoon light, creating perfect conditions for painting glazes and examining the subtle variations in texture that made each piece unique. Working with clay had evolved from a hobby into something approaching a calling, and having dedicated space for it felt like a luxury I had never known I needed. My legal situation resolved more quickly than Detective Green had initially predicted. Faced with overwhelming documentary evidence and the prospect of a highly publicized trial, Clayton's lawyers negotiated a plea agreement that included full restitution of stolen funds, substantial additional damages, and a felony conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life. The financial settlement was generous enough to ensure my security for the rest of my life, but more importantly, it validated everything I had discovered and revealed. The legal system had confirmed that I had been the victim of systematic fraud, and that my decision to expose the truth publicly had been both justified and necessary. Clayton himself seemed to age a decade in the months following the chapel confrontation. The confident, commanding presence that had once intimidated me into submission was replaced by the demeanor of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him: his reputation, his business, his financial security, and his future with Savannah. He moved to a small apartment across town and took a job with the accounting firm that specialized in helping small businesses with basic bookkeeping, a dramatic step down from the prestigious practice he had built over decades. We encountered each other occasionally around town, interactions that were brief and awkward, but no longer painful for me. The man who had once controlled every aspect of my life now seemed diminished and irrelevant, someone from my past rather than a continuing presence in my present. A year after the chapel confrontation, I received an unexpected piece of mail that brought the story full circle. It was an invitation to Clayton and Savannah's wedding, or rather, what would have been their first anniversary if the ceremony had proceeded as planned. But instead of a celebration, it was a notice of Clayton's bankruptcy filing and a request for information about additional assets that might be available to creditors. The irony was perfect. The man who had stolen from me to finance his dream life had lost everything through his own greed and deception. The cottage on Maple Street had been sold to pay legal fees. The romantic getaways and expensive gifts had been financed with credit that now demanded repayment. The carefully constructed fantasy of a comfortable retirement with his college sweetheart had collapsed under the weight of criminal charges and civil liability. But for me, that anniversary represented something entirely different. It marked 1 year since I had reclaimed my power, my voice, and my right to live authentically. It commemorated the day I had transformed from a victim of deception into a woman who demanded truth and accountability. I celebrated that anniversary by hosting a dinner party in my apartment for the women who had become my chosen family: Kennedy, Summer, Riley, and several others who had supported my journey from accommodation to authenticity. We raised glasses of wine to second chances, late life reinvention, and the courage required to start over when most people assumed your story was already written. To Eliza, Kennedy said, offering the toast, who showed all of us that it's never too late to become who we were meant to be. As I looked around my small apartment filled with friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with marriage or external validation. I had built a life that was entirely my own creation, funded by my own resources, and filled with relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The woman who had accidentally discovered her husband's betrayal through a misdirected letter had been passive, trusting, and dependent on others for her sense of worth and security. The woman sitting in her own home, surrounded by friends who celebrated her courage and independence, was someone entirely different, strong, self-determined, and finally, completely free. At 65, I was just beginning to discover who Eliza King, I, had reclaimed my maiden name, was capable of becoming. And for the first time in decades, I couldn't wait to find out what came next. The 3 bank statements that had once represented the destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life had become the foundation for everything I had built since. Sometimes the most devastating truths become the most liberating revelations, if you have the courage to act on them. I had found that courage in the back pew of St. Catherine's Chapel, and I had never looked back. 3 years later, I stood in the Millbrook Community Center's main gallery, surrounded by my ceramic sculptures displayed under professional lighting. The exhibition was titled Second Chances: The Art of Transformation, and it featured my work alongside pieces from other women who had reinvented themselves later in life. The centerpiece was a large sculptural installation I'd created called 3 Truths, 3 interlocking forms representing the discovery, the confrontation, and the renewal that had shaped my journey from victim to survivor to artist. The piece had been purchased by a collector from the state capitol, but tonight it remained on display for the exhibition's opening reception. As I watched people examine my work, really seeing it, discussing its meaning, connecting with the emotions I'd poured into each piece, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with authentic self-expression. "The artist is here," Kennedy announced to a small group gathered around one of my earlier pieces, a bowl I'd created during those first angry weeks after discovering Clayton's betrayal. The glaze was dark and turbulent, shot through with gold, veins that emerged from the chaos like hope breaking through despair. "What inspired this piece?" a young woman asked, her voice respectful and genuinely curious. "Betrayal," I said simply, "and the discovery that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing you create for yourself." Later that evening, as I cleaned up after the reception, I reflected on how far I'd traveled from the woman who had accidentally opened that letter from Henderson and Associates. That woman had been living someone else's definition of success, accepting someone else's version of love, and trusting someone else to determine her worth. The woman locking up the gallery that night was someone I was proud to be. Independent, creative, surrounded by genuine friendships, and completely honest about who she was and what she wanted from life. Clayton had given me 3 things, though not intentionally: the revelation of his deception, the documentation of his crimes, and the opportunity to discover my own strength. The 3 bank statements that had once threatened to destroy my world had instead become the foundation for rebuilding it entirely, and I had never been happier to be wrong about how my story would end up next. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.